Once the founder has set the vision for what the protocol or what the PermaWeb app is, it simply cannot be changed. And so there is no possibility that you can get this sort of slow corruption of the ideal over time that has characterized the Web 2 era. And that I think is just unbelievably exciting.
Like maybe it was a necessary evolution, right?
Yeah.
Do you think we could have gotten here without all that?
Well, you're really hitting at the key philosophical underpinnings of the thing.
You're tuned to the ArCast, where we talk about the blockchain on the ArCast and how your data remains. It's the ArCast, where ArDrive is the topic, censorship-resistant permanence. Yeah, we got it. Welcome to the second episode of the ArCast, and we have been blown away by the response to the first episode with Professor Mark Lemley. The response has been awesome. Thank you for all your tweets, for all your comments. Thank you for sharing. This podcast is now part of the PermaCast. Shout out to Arweave News, and we want to shout out the ArDrive knowledge base. Everything you need to know about ArDrive. For all your educational needs, go to ardrive.io/learn and click on Explore Knowledge Base in the bottom right-hand corner. So we've got some other exciting news. We hit 2,000 followers on Twitter. Woo! We're on Instagram, ArDrive app. We're on Facebook, ArDrive apps, and check us out on YouTube and just spread the word. So that's what's up. So before we get into this exciting interview, we want to shout out our bounty winner, CHSSS3, Chess3 on Twitter. Their drive was a delicious trip around the food of China. And our theme for November was food. So they won some AR. Shout out to all the supporters. Thank you for participating. Our next bounty starts on December 1st, so stay tuned for information about that. Thanks to Akash for hosting the PermaWeb Hackathon with Arweave. That was super exciting. And with the holidays coming up, don't stray too far from our socials because we have a special gift. You know, a lot of things might change over the holidays. Things get fungible, wink, wink. But we're not going to talk about that. No fungible talk. NFT today. Hey! All right, so this is my interview with Sam Williams, who really needs no introduction, but here we go, episode 2 of the ArCast. All right, friends, welcome to episode 2 of the ArCast, and we couldn't have a more appropriate, wonderful guest. This is a man who I met IRL at the Arweave meetup in New York a few weeks ago. And it's great to have him on the show. So welcome, Sam Williams, to the ArCast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I thought today it'd be kind of interesting to talk about some of the philosophy behind this project, talk about your own journey. But some background on me, I got my start in the music business. I was doing my Shakespeare studies for undergrad at Oxford, and I started rapping about Shakespeare when I was in 2003. And there was a label that signed me, and it was this interesting result of building this community of people who were definitely outside of the mainstream, major label world, but building this community where the equity was in the culture itself, in making the friendships, building this DIY network. And as I learned more about Web 2 and the transference to Web 3, where it's about building a decentralized culture. And I think there's some connections here. And there's something like about British people, specifically in European people, that I felt made that work. Do you think your being from Germany and studying in England has given you sort of the right perspective to do this, to be the man to launch this project?
It's an interesting question. I wouldn't say so. I would say that nowadays I find myself sort of culturally detached from every country that I've have spent much time in. So I grew up in the UK, and then I spent 3 or 4 years in Germany. I spent a lot of time in the US along the way. And nowadays I find myself in this weird detached state where I can see the cultures around me, but I don't really feel attached to any of them particularly. Which is definitely interesting. But also when I started Arweave, it really wasn't that way. I was very much part of the British culture, I suppose. And actually, no, to be honest, I've always been more attached to the culture of the internet than I would say any nation state. And that truly was the reason that, part of the theme in my life, I suppose, that led to the inception of the Arweave project. It seemed that the values of the internet were under threat and were eroding, and it was time for a technological solution to the problem, I suppose you could say.
And it's interesting, Sam, because I know some of the ideological origins for the Arweave project are surrounding Orwell in 1984 and how he was like during the Spanish Civil War when he felt like there was this authoritarian regime that was replacing the old ways.
Indeed.
In a way that was like, oh, we're going to make everything better. But in fact, it wasn't. And so it was like a satirical take on that. So did you see a similar thing happening with the internet you grew up with?
That's an interesting question. I've never thought about it from that point of view. I didn't believe, I suppose, the arguments that were put forward for vast censorship of the internet were really going to achieve the ends that the people putting them forward believed that they would, or at least said that they believed that they would. It seemed to me pretty obvious that the thing that is great about the internet is that nobody gets to tell anyone else definitively what the truth is. We allow people to make up their own minds. And we were moving towards a situation more reminiscent of the pre-internet world, where consensus truth was, would you say, projected from above upon the populace rather than emerging from the grassroots, if that makes sense. And it just intuitively felt to me that this was obviously not going to work, and that the power of the internet is in that ability for people to come to more or less decentralized consensus about what the truth is. And it just seemed obvious that the situation was not going to end well, I suppose.
So I guess, Sam, like talking to you and watching your interviews, it seems like you're an optimist about what this project could do. Would you think you are?
I would say I am very optimistic about what the Arweave ecosystem is capable of doing, and frankly, every day I'm surprised and amazed and excited by what people are building on top of it. I would say that actually the production of Arweave came from a more pessimistic viewpoint in some sense. Like, we were looking at the development of, or would you say the tendency in which society was moving at the time, and I think unfortunately largely still is in the West, and we were afraid that what might happen is the development of seriously authoritarian states in the West. And so we wanted to put a blocker in the way, if you will, something that can't be removed, that it would at least slow down, if not halt, the development of such a situation. And it wasn't, fantastically optimistic that it would solve the problem entirely. But we wanted to at least make it so that, full information control would never be possible in the West by a centralized party. You could never take away the right of free speech from people. So to some extent, it was motivated more by a defense of the rights that we largely currently have, more than an optimistic view of, that this might be able to solve problems in places where perhaps this stuff already exists. Like, I never believed that we would be able to turn back the tide in a place like North Korea. Like, unfortunately, that just isn't realistic. What we can at least do is make sure that we're keeping an accurate and an incorruptible record of history that is available everywhere else in what you could call the free world. And at least that does something to try and address the problem. Yeah. So that was the sort of core motivation. I think since then, to be honest, and when we got started, the project seemed almost impossible. Like, building a web is, it's like a laughably outlandish proposition, almost. And yet where we are now, like 5 years later, and the ecosystem that has built up around the project, it feels like a question of when, not if, at this point. And that's something that I'm just immensely grateful for. Like, it's really astounding to see where the community has gone during that period.
And the last 20 years of life on this planet has shown that even when people have good intentions, if you have kind of a capitalist-driven element or a venture capitalist having to make back their investment, if that is what pushes progress, you're not able to make things, like you've said, sustainable, open, transparent, and fair, right?
So that's a really interesting point. We're almost at the position where we can start kind of retrospectively looking at the history of the Web 2 era and making some sort of conclusions. And I think one of those conclusions has to be something like the startup culture of Web 2 was dominated by hyper optimism and idealism, which over time was met by a hard reality that the incentive structures in which these new products were being produced was not in the favor of the users. So the story that played out like dozens and dozens of times, if not hundreds of thousands of times during that period, was essentially that optimistic founders would get together and they would excitedly build a new product and they would want to change the world for the better. And they would go about, largely doing that, like building products that did make the world better. But over time and typically through the process of governance of the companies that produce these products, the initial vision became corrupted. So, of course, everybody knows that the founding principle of Google was essentially, how did they phrase it precisely? It was essentially do no evil. Don't be evil is how they phrased it. They truly believed that was what they wanted to, head out and do. And Facebook, too, wanted to connect people. These are like good, idealistic visions of the future. But the problem is that over time, naturally they sold parts of the company and they also sold control of the company as they progressed. And through no fault of any of the people involved in the situation, but through a sort of natural consequence of the incentive structure that was in which the tech culture found itself, you naturally get this slow erosion of the ideals and the replacement with hard profit motive. And what makes me so excited about the crypto space and more specifically about permaweb applications is that they're a kind of incorruptible product in a form. They are a once the founder has set the vision for what the protocol or what the permaweb app is, it simply cannot be changed. And so there is no possibility that you can get this sort of slow corruption of the ideal over time that has characterized the Web 2 era. And that I think is just unbelievably exciting. Like
maybe it was a necessary evolution, right?
Yeah.
Do you think we could have gotten here without all that?
Well, you're really hitting at the key philosophical underpinnings of the thing. Okay, so I think that in the early days of the internet, the protocols were all produced in an open and free fashion, and those protocols themselves were incorruptible. HTTP remains non-corrupted from its original vision and version as it was in 1991, 1992, when Tim Berners-Lee, first put like fingers to keyboard and came up with the first version. So protocols have always had this ability to not resist corruption in the early, and indeed that was the basic way that things were produced in the early days of the internet. IRC, TCP, UDP, HTTP, like all of the fundamental stuff that runs the internet is protocols. The problem was that those protocols produced unbelievable amounts of value and captured none of it, like zero, for its creators. And we live in a world where people are motivated by incentives. So somewhere along the line, the focus shifted to companies that were able to capture some of the value that they were creating. But I believe this was an unintended consequence, was that they also captured a massive amount of power. And the problem is, once you've got power, doing nothing is still using it. Like once you have power, there's nothing you can do which isn't making use of it.
Right.
And then, of course, at the same time, they amassed that power in these corporations, which the founders were slowly selling. And how else would they realize that value, right? And sure enough, at some point, you just lose control over the thing. And now, Google of today is very different from Google of the start. And I'm reminded of, Jack at Twitter once tweeted, "Twitter is the free speech wing of the free speech party." And if you compare that to where they are today, it's just like, come on, it's not the same thing. And I think that I don't think that they wanted to capture that power. And I actually think that the fact that you see some of these founders that were, the prime players in the Web 2 space now embracing and being so excited about Web 3 alternatives shows that underlying what has happened, there is still an ideological desire to have what I would call like the initial culture of the internet, where it's sort of about free expression and communication of ideas, free association of people in communities, and so on. The spirit of openness, if you were to put it in a single phrase, persist and prevail. And I think what happened in the crypto space, and what makes me sort of one of the reasons I kind of intrinsically conclude that eventually we will end up replacing all or most company-like structures on the web, is that the natural tendency of the web was towards protocols. We moved away from it because we couldn't capture value in protocols. And now, after the birth of Bitcoin, we know how to build protocols that do capture value. And I would say that a PermaWeb app is really kind of protocolization of a web application. And so, yeah, in that sense, I see it as the sort of natural next step, and both a moving forward in a way, but also kind of like a rekindling of something that you could say died unnecessarily just because of the lack of technological progress at the time, back in the early 90s.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I remember when I read Snowden's book, Permanent Record, he talks about how... Have you read it?
Yes, it's a very interesting book.
It's interesting how he talks about the early years of the internet and the fun part of being anonymous and being not monitored, and how his desire to share what he learned was kind of a desire to similarly go backwards and bring back like the kind of the quote unquote magic of the early years of the internet. And it sounds like from the Arweave community, one of the things that people love about it is that blockchain is so profit driven. And when we were talking at the Arweave meetup about how like it's become like a casino. It's like Vegas to some people, it's like it's got that element of it. But if you can try to do good with it or try to do something functional, that makes the whole project stand out.
I don't think it has to be a casino. And I think even in the more casino-like areas of it, underneath the rampant speculation, there is often a technological core which is extremely powerful and will likely show itself to be very valuable in a sort of pro-social fashion, not zero-sum speculative fashion over a number of years. I do, however, see that a number of the major applications on the smart contract systems so far have sort of become like programmable casinos, would be one way of thinking about it.
Right.
Yeah, but the central technology that defines blockchains is a technology surrounding trust. And so one of the use cases of that is, of course, in the financial industry, where the cost of trust is extremely expensive. A second use, I think, is around information, and that, of course, is where the Arweave community is focused. So I would say that. Yeah, you could argue that the central thing that Arweave does is change the relationship between people and information. Make it so that there is information that is trustlessly available forever. And to go back to what you're saying about the culture of the early internet, I definitely feel like there's a lot of that re-emerging inside the Arweave ecosystem, and that's super fun to watch. I remember even in the one of the second or third applications ever built on top of Arweave was this thing called Hot Dog Rhythm Station by Ross McMahon, and it was just this fun little application that it was like a I'm not sure what you call them, like a kind of simple drum sequencer. You could load in samples and stuff. You could save it to the PermaWeb and then load people's and fork it and resave it and so on. But it just had that kind of spirit of fun, and I think the same has permeated through a lot of the ecosystem as it's developed. I hope we can hold on to that as we go forward.
Yeah, me too. I like how you put that. And I think the interesting thing like about Web 2 is that the value comes from the attention that people give to media and content, right? So like the venture capitalists trade on the idea that you'll get so many eyeballs, so many minutes, and the data and the content is infinite. The way they try to serve it and add different permutations of it to get the algorithms knowing people are paying attention. But something that's so exciting about Arweave and working with ArDrive is when I use the application, I store things on the Weave that I care about, like small files that are particularly interesting. That makes it so the value is not from the infinite media, it's from my connection to specific special pieces of data that I care about. And that takes me back to being like 11 years old and having like a tiny 3.5-inch floppy with like my poetry or something like that. Like this, that less is more, when you have to be thoughtful. Have you ever thought of it like that? Like the whole minimalist thing where you use it in a more thoughtful way than you would if you weren't saving everything permanently.
Yeah, well, I think it's a tool that demands one's attention while making use of it. There is no undo button, right? So you really have to treat it with some... it's my own creation to it, at least some extent, so I don't want to big up its ego too much, but you got to treat it with some kind of respect, right? Like, it is not a toy in a way. So yeah, I think when I use it, I pay much more attention to what I'm doing, and this is something that we spend a lot of time in the early days trying to work out how. Users aren't really used to stuff that truly cannot be undone in cyberspace. There's always an undo button. There's always a delete button. And we spend a lot of time trying to work out how we can, impress upon the users the seriousness of what they're doing, the fact that they cannot revoke it in the future. They are changing the power relationship, not just between other people and the data that they're committing to the network, but themselves and the data that they're committing to the network. They're making it trustlessly available for all people for all time. So our early experiments involved stuff like you had to type confirm in big capital letters before you committed something to the network. I still think there's a conversation to be had in the ecosystem about how we can set up user experience best practices so that we can have a good set of tools to use to express to the user the seriousness of what they're doing while they're doing it, without hopefully getting in the way of the user flow too much. There's a fine balance to be struck there.
I just did a video for ArDrive, and I worked, and Phil, gave us some ideas, and one of his ideas was to make a folder that says trash, and stuff that you don't want to have there, you put into the quote unquote PermaTrash, which is kind of like a
PermaTrash.
It's like a workaround, right? It's like, I thought that was a clever way of using the RFS system in a way that feels like people are used to with files and making it more useful, but also those files are always there. Like having to be flexible with the application and with the Weave, right? And like using it in a way you used to use it, but knowing that you have to approach it differently. Like if you have anything incriminating or anything you don't want people to know, don't put that in a public PermaTrash because people will find it, right?
Well, yeah, don't use the Weave for anything criminal, please.
Yeah.
It's a really terrible system for that. It makes a permanent log of everything you're doing. It's not a good idea. But yeah, the idea of a PermaTrash is interesting. I wonder whether a more appropriate thing to do is, and this is a kind of community decision, I suppose, to simply hide it. So it's just gone from the UI. Obviously, it's still on the network, but you can't see it anymore. I think this is a pattern that people are tending towards. So that way, the person, would you say, the accessor's rights to re-access a piece of information that they've seen before are preserved, but also you get some sort of I was going to say kind of forgiving nature of the system a little bit. It bends a little bit to people's whims, but not not too much, if that makes sense. Like kind of middle ground, I suppose.
And not sacrificing the integrity of the whole
right.
reason.
It doesn't Right. It doesn't sacrifice the integrity of the system, but it does allow you to correct a mistake, like a spelling mistake or something like that. I remember back in the back in the really early days of the PermaWeb, I think within the first year of launch, I made this application. I think it's called Message in a Bottle or something. I was going to say it's probably still around, but of course it's still around. But it had a spelling mistake, if I'm not mistaken, on the first deployed version. And there was this weird moment when I was looking at the screen, I was like, that is something I'm never going to be able to take back. It's permanently attached to my identity. Interesting. We're going to have to sort of, I guess you could say, become more forgiving of each other's mistakes, because and that's something that we're already having to do in the digital age. Like, it's very clear that we produce more logs of our activity than we used to in the 70s or 80s and before. Yeah, and so I think there's an interesting long-term philosophical conversation that will have to be had around how we approach each other's prior, whether it be spelling mistakes or otherwise.
Less than representational
right.
human behavior.
Yeah. Right.
This is something that maybe, I don't know if people have asked you this in interviews and stuff, but I'm wondering, being someone who has made such a wave in the blockchain world and has this notoriety within this community and in this sphere, is it hard for you to decipher, like, what are real friendships versus what are people who are trying to, like, be close to for what they can do to get their own gain? How do you deal with that?
No one has asked me that before, and that is an interesting question. I would say, to be honest, I don't think I have that much notoriety or prominence. So, it hasn't really been a problem, I wouldn't say. To some extent, it feels like the inverse is almost true. Like, from almost all the time we've been building Arweave, it's been an uphill battle to get people to sort of see what it is we're working on and why and how the system works and so on. So if anything, we were sort of like at the edge of the... Yeah, I still think we kind of... Because of the reason that you described earlier, that Arweave is something pretty different than the rest of the crypto space, it's really not focused on finances at all. I don't know. That just hasn't been something that's been at the core of the experience. I'm actually just mostly very thankful to my friends that I have had over the years for supporting me and also the project and each other, because a lot of them were involved in it through the growth period. And now it seems like we're at this position where there is a bit more prominence of the project. People start to understand why it's significant and what it allows people to do and the capabilities and so on. But along the way, I can't say that I felt that so much.
So you don't have that sort of like celebrity paranoia that some other people might have.
It at least hasn't been. I would say I'm simply not a celebrity, so that's helpful. And yeah, the reverse was true. Like, now I think about it, I'm immensely grateful to my friends who at the beginning took this massive bet to quit their jobs and start working on this. What was at the time, as I described, in the beginning, completely crazy idea to go out and build a new web. Like Kyle, India, Will, Damon, those people I'm immensely grateful to. They really helped us get out of the gate in a way that took a lot of trust and inverse celebrity. It was really like, quit your nice job doing cool things elsewhere where you like got a prominent position, blah, blah, blah. To come work on this garage project to build a new web was completely absurd, but they did it, and I'm very thankful.
Genuine passion and curiosity is contagious, and it's like what I think makes great things happen in the tech world, even though that might seem kind of like a cliche thing. Like, if you generally care about something, that's one of the reasons I was glad to come work with ArDrive, is because Phil is such a passionate visionary, and he cares about it. And how do you feel that ArDrive can help with your vision for where you're hoping Arweave will go?
I mean, for a start, I would, just to link this question to the last one, I would put Phil amongst the early believers, in which I am truly very, very thankful. Because, Phil started mining Arweave in the testnet days, if I'm not mistaken, and has stuck with us through thick and thin in the intervening period. And then, was it just 15 or 16 months ago, he quit his job at a very, very reputable firm I don't know if it's public what it is, so I won't mention it, but a really reputable firm and an incredible position to come and build one of the first major PermaWeb apps. And that was an incredible leap of faith for which I'm truly very, very thankful that he took. And now I think it's working out in an incredible way, because ArDrive is just one of the most important applications in the ecosystem, because it's the, obviously one of the main questions I get asked is like, hey, how do I get data onto the thing?
Right.
And to most people, they're not used to dealing with protocols. They're used to dealing with products, right? So the answer is, well, I use the product. But with the protocol, it's a bit different. And my answer is always, go use ArDrive. It's a great user interface, and it's a great way to onboard new users to the world of the PermaWeb. And I love the way that Phil approaches this, which is really just to, and the whole of the ArDrive team actually, to make it as simple as possible, to really cut down the barriers, make it to some extent like as uncrypto-y, I'm doing like scare quotes, but unfortunately you can't see, uncrypto-y as possible, while maintaining all of the upsides of the technology. So not sacrificing, for example, user identity, ownership over user identity. And indeed, I'm very, very thankful to you and the rest of the communications team at ArDrive, who are doing a fantastic job at getting the word out about how the system works. I think you are essentially at this point the ecosystem's #1 rapper. So yeah, thank you so much for the work you do to spread the word on it too. Yeah, of course.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate your time, and it's something that I'm very passionate about and excited about, and using Web 2 and using the old way people get information to tell them about this new way of sharing and celebrating information and staying free in a way that, like, hopefully the future generations will understand that truth does exist and a permanent record will tell our story, and people will look back and say, wow, this was a interesting moment in the blockchain history. So Sam, thank you so much for your time. This has been a really, really great interview, and I appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I think TLDR is me and the rest of the Arweave team greatly appreciate all of the work everyone's put into this to get us this far. There's something funny about, okay, I mentioned before, definitely in my own eyes, certainly not a celebrity, but there is something just really frankly kind of rewarding about the fact that we're here on an ArCast set up by someone else. That's just an amazing moment in the journey we're on. This is really cool. So thank you so much for setting this up, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you, Sam, for your time. Follow him on Twitter because he is very active and very supportive. Sam E.C. Williams. And remember, it's best to know before you stow your data forever. Mic drop.